Hi, welcome to the Soapbox podcast. Today we are taking a trip to a remote, unfamiliar and mysterious swamp. Throughout this journey we will be accompanied by the soundpiece Ecotonal Echoes, Eventually Everything is Swamp, by the Fieldfictions collective. Our guests today are Dominika and Iulia, who will talk about this project in more detail.
Hi, my name is Dominika. I study cultural analysis at the University of Amsterdam, and together with Iulia we work on the collective Fieldfictions, and we also have one more member. Her name is Sophie, who is in prison today. But yeah, I'm excited to talk more about our project.
Same here, I'm Iulia, and I'm studying, I'm finishing artistic research. It's a research master at the University of Amsterdam. And yeah, excited.
We're excited to have you on our very first episode.
Yeah, and also your field guide is going to be present in our upcoming issue. So that's also why we wanted to include your sound piece as our first ever episode, because not only to share the sound piece, but also to bring it closer, I guess, for the Soapbox reader and listener in this case.
Thank you so much for that. We really appreciate the invite.
Let's start off with our first question. In your description of the sound piece, you say, I quote, "The swamp speaks." And I just wanted to talk a little bit more about that, because I'm interested in this idea of the swamp speaking and how can we listen to what it's talking about. If the swamp kind of exists as a metaphor for our relationships, namely between nature and human, as well with our changing ecosystem, how do we respond to the language of the swamp?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think it's always been a bit of this confusion if the swamp is between nature and human, or if it's both of those, because I think it is important and useful to think of the swamp as land and as a shifting land and not yet a territory. And what I mean by this is basically what I read. I read this text by Edouard Glissant the other day, and he beautifully summarizes this tension between land and territory. And I quote, he says, "Territory is the basis for conquest. Territory requires filiation to be planted and legitimized. Territory is defined by its limits and they must be expanded." So, in our project, we interacted with swamps that are part of the Netherlands landscape. And it's basically more on the side of like the human-built, man-made, turned into territory rather than kept as sacred land. And this is an interesting question in itself, because sometimes these changes that are part of sometimes changes that seem part of the landscape are actually changes that are part of the human-made environment. So basically like of the people who work at a natural preservation and they take care of the landscape and they make it seem as if that's how it is. But then it's also sometimes indeed the opposite, so the swamp taking over the landscape and of its own fate in a way. So I think in a way to respond to the swamp is to attune to the ecosystem and to use your senses as ways of moving in the landscape and thinking that it's multivocal and political at the same time.
Swamps are in-between territories, places of submerged perspectives and wetland echoes. The swamp speaks. How can we listen? Swamps are transitional, fluctuating between ecological conditions, stories, and affects. They are neither fully land nor fully water. They are landscapes of shifts and changes, constantly adapting to flows of energy. They are landscapes of unbounded imaginative potential. Swamps have been perceived as places of encounter, of refuge, of freedom, of resistance, of obstruction.
I get from that you kind of also need to acknowledge as well the sort of hidden relationship between man and nature in this sense, where where something seems natural or something seems natural, but indeed it has been facing processes of extraction and whatnot. So in that sense, we need to listen to those subdued voices of the swamp.
Yeah, I think that sums it up.
Okay, nice.
A nice segue to our second question. I really like that you picked like the swamp, like an object that is not necessarily like the first pick for everyone. And your description of the sound piece reads, wetland ambience, stories and speculations meshed together in an attempt to immerse you into the critical sensibilities of swamp. And we wanted to ask you, why are swamps these worthwhile objects of study, and why do they matter, why should they matter, and what sort of critical lens does the swamp offer?
This is a question that we keep on asking to ourselves. I think it's important to go back to the beginning, and our initial project started when Iulia and I got talking about Eastern Europe and its relation to Western Europe, and both of us were interested in Eastern European studies, post-colonial theory, and environmental history. And then at the time I was reading a lot about modernism and land engineering, and one of the texts that I was reading was about training of swamps in Eastern Europe and them not being drained before, and how that was a marker of the uncivilized Eastern Europe. So kind of that was the first time that the narrative of backwardness was established, and this text was by Michał Pospisil. I'm not gonna gatekeep that, but then I was thinking about swamps as this space that is really hard to modernize and requires a lot of energy, and therefore spaces that can't afford to or simply don't want to drain them are then destined to be uncivilized. But then, of course, I'm a humanities student, so like my interests are also in like literature and creative work. So then I was thinking about like mythology, and the initial parts of our project with Iulia and Sophie were just basically brainstorming different representations of swamps. What initially sparked our interest as the swamp as a space resistant to modernity proved to not only be legible for Eastern Europe, but for actually many histories across the world. And also it has its sneaks into very popular cultural artifacts, and then of course super prominent in Slavic folklore, but also Greek mythology. And then today we also have like the show Swamp Thing and Shrek, and it's just kind of the narrative always ends at the swamp is the place of the outcasted, the weird, and the thing that doesn't conform to like dominant culture. And and this was kind of the initial point where we were like, oh, like swamps are interesting, like why are we imagining swamps like that? Let's go to the swamp. And then we're Netherlands based, so our first trip was to the Ilperveld swamp in the Netherlands, and we were like theorizing swamps, inaccessible spaces, la la la, and then we went to the swamp, and then we didn't think about the fact that the swamp will not be accessible to us either, so we couldn't actually go there. And then we were just like surrounding the swamp, and we were, expecting this mystery, darkness, but what actually was there was, yes, exactly, it was like pavement, like polders, like highly engineered land. And then we were like, then we were like, this is a bad example. Let's go to a different swamp, the Nardermeer, one of the oldest like swampland formations in the Netherlands. It's actually like a nature reserve at the moment and a bird watching popular space. And it's also like light, beautiful, flat, designed for people to do like hobbies like bird watching. So it's not really what we ever expected to see. And then we were like, then I think this one became a really interesting critical lens to begin doing research, because of this contradiction of the swamp we imagine it, or like our relation to it based on imagination is one that is inspired by like resistance and not conformity and refuge and almost a sanctuary of some imagination, but then in the end, like, we cannot assume that swamps exist outside of this realm, because you go to the Dutch swamp and it's been modernized, and then we were thinking of, okay, so this is the contradiction that we're working with, and there's many points of departure. That's why in our soundpiece there's so much, and maybe most things are not developed deep enough, but it's just a position that you can start off to think about many different elements of like social and environmental life.
The swamp was a very different understanding, like, because you basically have forests in Eastern Europe, and you have forests that are not easily accessed by people, and you have mountains, of course, and these are environments that shift all the time. So like, if people are not taking the reins over the landscape, then you don't really know in which direction the swamp develops in that way. So yeah, I guess it did. And I mean, there are so many other things that show us that divide, right? Even though it's like loads of Eastern European countries are part of Western Europe, or like of Europe in general, you still see this kind of lines even in the environment.
Swamps are transitional, fluctuating between ecological conditions, stories, and affects. They are neither fully land nor fully water. There are landscapes of shifts.
The swamp is porous,
Constantly adapting to
transcorporeal,
There are
permeable.
landscapes of unbounded imaginative potential.
acts
Swamps
as
are
a
one of the
shelter,
highest stores
a
of soil
sponge,
carbon in the
a
biosphere.
wasteland,
It is a
and
space
a
of deep
fertile
carbon
site of
absorption.
regeneration.
I grew up with a lot of swamp mythology in Slovakia. Actually, one of the most popular children's stories that we had revolved around this swamp man figure who was both like a magical being of sorts because he would help you regenerate, but at the same time he was deemed as ugly, and you know everyone was kind of afraid of him. But in the end, when he spoke, when the swamp spoke, he turned out to be a very friendly, very loving sort of person, which I think that could also somehow play into this metaphor of like you can be afraid of the swamp because of its dark and murky connotations, but in the end the swamp is going to be loving back to you no matter what. And I think this also can connect to, I guess, this idea of the swamp being for outcasts, that you know you never really you don't give them a voice, but when you do, people have so much to say.
Swamps are one of the highest stores of soil carbon in the biosphere. It is a space of deep carbon absorption. In constant flux, they cycle between blooming and dying. The soil in the swamp slows decomposition, leading to stores of organic matter, capturing carbon beneath the surface. They purify and filter water, absorbing chemical fertilizers like nitrogen. Vital primordial technology. Swamps shelter marine animals, nursing the bloom of the ocean. They nurse us too, absorbing excess water, thus preventing landscapes from flooding.
It's great you say that because we also looked at a lot of Slavic folk tales. I think we also bumped into this one tale about Borovnik, which was exactly a very similar story to what you're saying.
The very subtle and gentle processes that occur within the wetland might come unnoticed to the human eyes. We are not trained to appreciate slow and subtle change.
Yeah. I think also like the idea of the preservation of swamp is very like what you mentioned about the Dutch swamps being modernized. I think also in Eastern Europe it's getting quite, I would say, interesting in the terms of how you perceive like preservation of swamps, because I know places that were kept very like wild and very true to like what they have looked like in the past, but I also know of places that were completely changed under the label of, you know, preserving them and keeping them as they were, but not really. That's also kind of heard in your soundpiece, because I also heard like some background noise of I think cars, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can see like swamp is making its way through the our like modern areas, but also like modern areas infecting the swamp.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like this, of course, goes back to the question of authenticity and how we cannot assume that like something will stay the same in a world that's constantly changing. And that's also why we chose to do a sound piece in the end, was because we went to the swamp and we were recording in the beginning various things about it. We were collecting mud and grass, and we were also, of course, doing video and pictures. But then it was really sound that came out to be like the natural medium, because in a picture you choose so much the frame. You can, portray it any way that you like. But with sound, we would like try to record the birds and the frogs and the weeds and the wind. But what would be most heard in the end was the train, or was the car, or was the tractor, or the people talking. Even like our devices were then in a way meant to capture these sounds rather than the natural sounds. And then we were like, okay, like this is kind of the disruption that we want to play with. And yeah, so then, as you were noticing in our soundpiece, this does kind of, is kind of like a character, like all these disruptions. And I mean, they're the authentic part of the Northern swamp. Like that's kind of, the train cuts right in the middle of it, and when you go there, you just travel through it to even get there in the first place.
The swamp disturbs, as it is not easily manageable, workable, or livable.
The sustaining of a swamp might not be in the interest of human development either, as it does not feed our need
its
to be in touch with nature.
Cannot easily be turned into an object to be commodified. For this reason, the swamp is a place for shelter.
The nature that we wish to be in touch with must meet our standards of beauty, therefore be clean and carry a pleasant scent.
Going along with the note of sound, I'm going to skip a bit forward and ask kind of how, well, you're basically telling a story about a swamp through sound. Why do you think sound is important in general for storytelling, or what role does sound play in your day-to-day lives?
For me, I think I have a pretty intimate relationship with sound, because that's also where my artistic practice kind of goes into. And I've started thinking a lot about sound as a medium as a medium for association, I think. Certain things that you hear that can send you somewhere else, or certain things that you hear and connect you to other people that might have heard the same kind of sounds. So in the end, I think sound is very fluid and sound is very collective, because we're all exposed to it.
How it felt at the time was that the swamp has more like a cyclical, long geological time where the difference between bloom and die-off is kind of non-existent, because there is bloom from die-off and things happen really slowly, and us working with sound, we couldn't capture the actual sounds of the swamp. Like we had hydrophones in the water, but there's nothing there unless you put your finger in the water, and then maybe there will be a sound. But this geological time of the swamp is not able to be captured by us. That's why we decided to talk about it. And then in contrast to that, there would be the urban time or the human time where this time is more connected to us constantly working towards through reproductive models and production and consumption and here I'm thinking about the workshop that we did in the swamp with a group of people, and then we had some exercises, which were actually the exercises getting published in the swamped issue. And there's one exercise about affect, and it's just a creative writing exercise, and it's just writing about what you feel, of course. And one person I remember was talking about this experience, and then they were talking about how they felt so calm and nurtured when they were in the swamp. However, there was the recurring sound of the train, and the sound made them feel very anxious. And through this sound, that they were suddenly thinking a lot about responsibilities that they have in the city, or they were thinking about their financial situation and how they're like in the swamp laying around doing these exercises which we make them do, but they're ruining their clothes doing them, and of course this costs money, but this was all like happening because of the sound of the train. And it's not that it's the train who causes you to feel this way, it's the association you have with like constantly moving forward in a straight line and trying to live a life where you're trying to move forward instead of just sitting down and listening and feeling. And that's what we wanted to achieve through our guide. So I know that you asked about swamp because this is the feeling swamped, because this is the theme of the issue. And even though this is not something that we were thinking about, of course I think it underlined especially my interest. I don't know about you, Iulia, but I was definitely sparked with this feeling overwhelmed and overworked, and then seeing the representation of mud often last year as a marker of this feeling. And then I personally found like refuge in thinking about swamps as an escape from me feeling swamped and overwhelmed by everyday life.
Urban time that most of us are acquainted with is measured differently than the temporal dimensions of a swamp.
I think having also these moments of like being able to get together in spite of all of the other things we had to do was also the cure against feeling swamped, because we were just very grateful to be able to do this work with one another, but also to use this as an escape from the city and to just go to some like natural reserve or somewhere that's a bit like further out of the city, to just like really just gather our thoughts and feelings and put ourselves back together.
The swamp is porous, transcorporeal, permeable. It acts as a shelter, a sponge, a wasteland, and a fertile site of regeneration. A site of multiplicities, or an archive. The swamp is also a place of objection.
So the cure for feeling swamped is to think more and be more in the swamp.
Basically.
Yep.
I kind of want to, because actually what you were saying a bit earlier about when you had your installation that people were lying down and kind of were invited to think about themselves and about their associations with the sound they're listening to, and this whole idea of kind of a more slow cyclical time versus this rapid capitalist time of consumption that we're in right now. I would kind of like to use that as a way of thinking about home in a sense. Mm-hmm. And at least that's what that's what struck me most about our conversation, is that maybe the landscape of a swamp is so similar to home in terms of this warm, kind of mossy feeling that we get, especially if you grow up in the countryside, all these sonic associations, and also the slower time of the countryside and of home. But even if you grow up in a city, like I'm from Bratislava, which is the capital of Slovakia, but I still felt this sort of kind of tingly home feeling when I was listening to her sound piece, because it is, in the summer it gets very green and I wake up to sound of birds and everything like that, which is not it's not a common sound that I listen to here actually. So I was wondering if this kind of association with the swamp as kind of a fluid transposable home, especially for like Eastern Europeans, also kind of plays a part in your research.
Whilst in cities, temporality is understood with regard to human perceptions of usually linear development. In the swamp, it is measured within the cycle of the small, slow, and fragmented processes that occur within the larger axis of the long-term formation of marsh.
I'm obsessed with the idea of home. I don't know why there is this obsession with, or like longing for home once you like move somewhere else. But there are certain things that just like immediately bring you back. It is movable and it's mobile, it's transforming and shifting, and I think as it transforms itself, it also transforms you and the other way around, and you kind of like take it with you.
In the swamp, we are introduced to the temporal dimensions of the dead or the decaying. The living creatures of the swamp all work together in sustaining the swamp's water, so that the seemingly timeless transformation of the die-off can occur. All organisms who enter the swamp contribute to marking out its borders with their bodies, as they join the network of water circulation. It is through osmosis, or mutual exchange of water, that different elements of the swamp's ecosystem are connected. It is also the way humans can be included in this ecosystem, if they comply with the laws established by water, air, constant transformation, mutual reliance, and degradation.
Whilst swamps are sustained by constant change, their cycles of bloom and decay intertwine with human paths, creating disturbance and releasing dormant carbon into the atmosphere. Anthropogenic bloom seeps into the world of the swamp, draining and putting these ecosystems at risk. These are the ruins on which human industry is built, the coastlands on which we sit. Even though neglected and silenced, swamps find ways to maintain their agency, to resist extraction, development, and history making.
So to round it all off, I'd like to ask you a bit more about your collective field fictions, how you came to be, why, and...
It was rather a spontaneous collaboration, but it came into being in the aftermath of this course called Rethinking Sustainability in and Through Arts and Culture, where we met Dominika, because I already knew Sophie. Yeah, and the project started with a bigger group as a class assignment. So we were, I think, 5 or 6 people working on this project together for the class, and then from there Sophie invited me and Dominika to collaborate for her graduation project for artistic research, and then we started working on a more elaborate part of the project so we can present it at the Apple. So I think also, the three of us complemented each other in many ways, because Sophie had an artistic background in video and design work. I have a background in creative writing and also field work. And Dominika has very thorough conceptual work, and also big cultural analysis lens in which we could flow these concepts around and she could ground them. I think we were all just very excited to do collaborative work, because academia tends to be rather individualistic and isolated, and we just wanted to push against that. And the goal of the soundpiece was to bring people closer to a certain place, so the wetlands and their multifocal stories. So the sound installation attempts to immerse the audience into the critical sensibilities of the swamp, and through sound we invite the audience to reflect on how the field situates them as body, subject, and an apparatus of feeling.
We also, of course, in the process had many trips to the swamp to do field work, and that was also something we were figuring out how to do. And then I think something that we had most fun doing is figuring out how to do field work collectively, or collaboratively, and then also how to communicate that to people who will hear the soundpiece, because of course the soundpiece is one part of the installation, but the other part was the companion for fieldwork that is also going to be part of the upcoming issue. So it was So the two are in some form of a dialogue with each other, but they're not really. I think our editor was always asking us in the editing process, how do we imagine the sound piece to work with the companion? But then, like, it really doesn't work because the companion is something that you just bring along if you do field work, and then the field can be understood in its broadest sense. I've asked anthropology students who was doing anthropology boot camp to take it with them, so they just for fun to see if people actually ask about it, and they did, and they enjoyed it, even though they were doing field work in some community center. And it's just, you know, something that you can really take metaphorically and then apply it to a field to just see how you position yourself within that field, because fieldwork, of course, is not only you doing research about something, but it's also how you do research with it, and what kind of conclusions you are able to draw and what kind of conclusions you aren't simply able to even observe. So the sound piece is something that we were able to observe, but we never claimed that this is something that actually represents Nardermere
or swamps
in general. It's just kind of our creative process. It probably tells you more about us than it does about the swamp. Nonetheless, I think, you know, it's like a healing exercise for myself, and I'm really glad we did it, and I learned a lot about swamps, past humanities research. I've read also a lot of of just like engineering academic papers, and for nothing to this project, because we didn't use any of that material, but it's still like you know, a lot to learn and not too much to be able to communicate. But yeah, that's kind of how we worked. And it was important to do it across disciplines, but since all of us are more into the creative or humanities disciplines, then we try to kind of bring more of an interdisciplinary approach, or as much as we could in the end.
I also think you succeeded in like creating a piece that also transcends from just like your phone or your like earphones, headphones, to like your body, and like just lingers somewhere and transcends this like tech focused like medium, and just bring like it just comes to life somehow. So I really also enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone who like sees it and hears it and reads about it in our upcoming issue will too. So thank you for taking the time to be here.
Thank you so much for the invite and for the kind words.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really big pleasure.